All right, hello and welcome to this training. As you can see from the title, what we're going to be covering today is how to become the future self faster. And as you can see from the overview, what we're going to be talking about more specifically is the gap between selves, the acceleration protocol, living as the future self now, the review, and finally your action items for the day or the next few days. Now, before we get started, if you want to work with me one-on-one, make sure to book a call from the link in the description. We work with entrepreneurs and high-level performers in different fields to basically help them master every aspect of their life, meaning health, wealth, love, and self, so that they can have a complete life and with one complete system. So if that interests you, then make sure to book a call from the link in the description. Now, if you want this training along with this document, then make sure to join the free community from the link in the description. And if you want weekly newsletters on how to improve in every aspect of your life, meaning health, wealth, love, and self, then make sure to join the free newsletter from the link in the description. With that said, let's get started and talk about the gap between selves. So there's a version of you that most likely already exists in your mind that you can see, you know what they do, you know how they carry themselves, you know what their day looks like, what they've built. And that version of you feels almost real in a strange way, almost tangible, like they're just slightly ahead of you, but on the same road. And the gap between who you are right now and who that person is, that gap, closing that gap is really the whole game, right? Everything that actually moves the needle, the discipline, the journaling, the identity work, the perception shifts, all of it is just about closing that gap. And the question this training answers is really, how do you close that gap faster? Now, the first step in closing the gap is getting genuinely clear on who the future self actually is. Now, most people skip this step or do it in a vague aspirational way where they say things like, I want to be successful or I want to be confident without ever really specifying what that actually looks like in any concrete daily terms. Now, the future self needs to be defined with enough specificity that you could basically recognize them if you saw them, meaning you know what time they wake up, what their morning looks like, how they handle conflict, what their default emotional state is, what they prioritize on a day-to-day basis, and how they spend their discretionary time, and etc. Right? The specificity really needs to extend to behavior as well, where you're not just describing outcomes like I'm fit, I'm rich, I'm respected, etc., but daily behaviors, meaning 2 hours of deep work before 10 a.m., for example, or strength training 4 times per week, or journaling every morning and evening. Is the behavioral specificity that will really make the future self actually actionable and will give you tangible actions that you could take in order to get there. Now, the more detail you can add, the more real the future self becomes in your mind, where even small details like what the future self eats for lunch or how they respond to a frustrating email help you to actually flesh out the picture and give your brain something concrete to really move towards to rather than an abstract ideal. And you need to be honest about the actual distance between where you are now and where the future self is. And that honesty, while it might be uncomfortable, is necessary because underestimating the gap leads typically to frustration for a lot of people when the progress feels slow, and overestimating it really leads to paralysis from feeling like the goal is too big and impossibly far away. So a clear-eyed assessment of the gap done through your journal, for example, shows you exactly which areas need the most work and which areas you're already close on. And that assessment gives you a prioritized map of where to focus your transformation efforts for maximum impact. Now, you don't necessarily have to do it just with a journal. You can also just rate each area of your life, health, wealth, love, and self. That framework of health, wealth, love, and self is really the reason I give it to you guys, is mostly because it compartmentalizes the different parts of your life, and you can now look at them separately but also together to basically find out which areas of my life need most work right now. And you can rate them on a scale of 1 to 10. The lowest one should get the most work right now. Now, accepting the gap without judgment is really important here, because how big the gap is doesn't say anything about you as a person. Don't take it personally. The gap isn't basically evidence that something is wrong with you. It's simply the space between where you are and where you're going. And treating it as neutral data is really the key here. You just basically want to look at it as a scientist with zero story behind it. And that will just keep the energy pointed forwards. Now, the second piece of the gap is really the timeline, meaning how long the transformation actually takes. And most people dramatically underestimate the time that is really required for deep identity change, which sets them up for disappointment and abandonment of the process before it's had really any time to work. Now, a realistic timeline, in my opinion, for a significant identity shift is measured in months, and sometimes, depending on what you want to achieve, years, right? The people who succeed at this are really the ones who commit to the process with a long enough time horizon that the compound effects have room to accumulate and also produce visible results. So patience with the timeline isn't passive waiting. You show up every day and you do the work while trusting that the results will come when they come. And that combination of daily effort and long-term patience is really the sweet spot that produces the fastest actual transformation. Because look at it this way, you didn't get to your current life in one day or in 1 week or in 1 month. It was probably a humongous amount of time of accumulated choices and decisions and thought patterns that got you to where you are. So have patience. Don't expect to change your life in a week, right? Don't expect to change your life in 2 weeks or a month. Sometimes it takes a bit longer. And also, you have zero control over when the change happens. The only thing you're entitled to is the work. You're not entitled to the results. You also are not entitled to when those results show up in any way. You're only entitled to putting in the work. And if you put in the work, the results will eventually come, but you have no control over when. I see a lot of people setting deadlines for themselves in terms of when they should achieve the things that they want to achieve, or when they should have achieved them by. This kind of habit of setting a deadline to success in any area is missing the point of success first entirely, because it's about who you become in the process rather than the outcome. Secondly, it attaches you to the outcome. And thirdly, it almost never works and it's completely arbitrary, right? These deadlines that you set for yourself are completely arbitrary, and they're not based in reality at all most of the time. You don't have control over when the results will come. You don't have control over when success will come. The only thing you have control over is putting in the work today. Success, the results, those are lagging indicators. Your actions today are leading indicators, and those are what you have control over. Again, you're not entitled to the results of the work, you're only entitled to the work itself. And so you have to have that patience in terms of when those results come and how long you put in the work for. And that's why it's so important to actually get in love with the process, because at the end of the day, the process is really all that matters. I know, cliche, but it's true. Your daily actions are all that matters at the end of the day. The problem with also setting deadlines like that to yourself that are completely arbitrary is, first, again, they're not based in reality. So most of the time they're shorter than they need to be. And secondly, because there is a deadline, you start looking for shortcuts. And in reality, what happens is the deadline comes, you haven't achieved anything because you've been busy looking for shortcuts the whole time. And now you're wasting a lot more time than if you just stuck to the process with no deadline and you just did the work day in and day out. Breaking the long timeline into shorter milestones is really what makes the journey feel manageable, where instead of looking at the 3-year version, you focus on the 90-day version or 1-week version or the 1-month version every 1 month or every week. And each 90-day milestone or 7-day milestone or 30-day milestone shows you enough progress to basically sustain your motivation for the next one. So the timeline of transformation is nonlinear, meaning progress often comes in bursts and then plateaus rather than a steady upward line. And a lot of the times it's very slow in the beginning and then it exponentially increases. And understanding this pattern in advance will just prevent you from panicking during the plateaus and quitting right before a breakthrough is about to happen. Plateaus are where the internal work is consolidating. Those dips are when the internal work is consolidating, and they're a necessary part of the process rather than a sign that something has gone wrong. Now, the people who push through those plateaus with consistent daily practice are typically the ones who eventually experience the breakthroughs that make the whole journey feel worth it. And breakthroughs tend to come suddenly after long periods of apparently slow or no progress, where one day you just notice that you're operating differently and that the old patterns are not firing in the same way they used to, and that the future selves behaviors have become your default now. And that sudden shift is really the compound effect of all the invisible daily work that has finally reached critical mass. Now, the core thing about closing the gap, the thing that actually drives the transformation, is really identity change, right? You become someone else in the process, where you're not just changing what you do, you're changing who you are, and the behavioral changes follow the identity change. Identity is primary and behavior is often secondary, meaning if you try to change your behavior without changing your identity, the old identity can eventually pull the behavior back to baseline. But if you change your identity first, the new behaviors emerge naturally as expressions of the new self. Sometimes it's the opposite way, though, where behavior is first and then identity changes because of behavior. But you need to be very consistent and do it for a long period of time in order to get there, right? Which means that evidence collection should be the highest priority in your daily practice, meaning above habit tracking, above productivity optimization, above everything else, but because the identity shift is really the single change that can make all the other changes sustainable and self-reinforcing. It becomes basically the big domino that once pushed, pushes all the other ones. So the speed of identity change can be accelerated through specific practices that we'll cover in the next section, where you deliberately increase the rate at which you collect evidence, meaning evidence for the fact that the new identity is becoming real, and the intensity with which it's processed. And that acceleration is really what allows you to become your future self in months. Now, the intensity of the daily practice matters because a 10-minute session of focused, deeply felt identity work will produce a lot more change in an hour than an hour of going through the motions. And it's that intensity that is something you can deliberately cultivate through priming and state management, meaning you get yourself into the right emotional and physical state before the session so that you're not just going through the motions. And increasing the frequency of identity reinforcing moments throughout the day beyond just the morning and evening sessions, for example, will create a sustained immersion in the new identity that dramatically speeds up the adoption process. Now, if you've ever watched any of my videos, you know that I typically say that you should reinforce the identity every morning and every evening. And if you increase that, if you increase the identity reinforcing moments, it can speed up the adoption process of the new identity. So with that said, let's cover the acceleration protocol. So let's talk about how to actually speed up the transformation. The gap between your current self and your future self can be closed faster than most people think if you use the right approach. Now, that approach isn't about working harder or hustling more, but rather about increasing the efficiency and intensity of the identity change process itself. I call it the acceleration protocol, and it takes the core principles of identity change and applies them with a specific focus on speed. Now, the first element of the acceleration protocol is immersion, meaning you deliberately saturate your daily experience with inputs, environments, and interactions that reinforce the future self's identity, so that the new identity isn't something you practice for 10 minutes and then forget about for the rest of the day, but rather it becomes your lived experience. So your environment should be redesigned to reflect the future self rather than the current self, meaning the physical spaces you spend time in, the tools you use, the information you consume, and the visual cues around you should all be aligned with who you're becoming rather than who you've been. And then the specific environmental cues that trigger future self thinking, like a written identity statement on your desk, or a screensaver that reflects your goals, or a workspace that is organized the way your future self would organize it, keep the new identity active in your awareness throughout the day and prevent the drift back into old patterns. And so removing environmental cues that reinforce the old identity is equally important, where anything in your space that anchors you to who you were rather than who you're becoming should also be eliminated or replaced. And that environmental pruning will accelerate the internal shift by reducing the external triggers for old patterns. Now, the next part of this is your inputs, the information you consume. And I think it's probably one of the biggest parts here, if not the biggest part. Your information inputs should be curated for identity acceleration, meaning the books, courses, coaching, podcasts, videos, and conversations you actually engage with should be specifically chosen to reinforce the future self's worldview, values, and behaviors. And consuming content that's aligned with where you're going will create that continuous stream of identity reinforcing information. And look, this isn't some new age idea, by the way. Every regime in history that successfully reshaped how people think started with the exact same move. If we look at the Soviet Union, for example, when the Soviet Union wanted to rebuild an entire population's identity after the revolution, the first thing they did wasn't military force, it was information control. They created an entire censorship apparatus called Glavlit, whose only job was really to filter every single piece of published material, every newspaper, every book, every radio broadcast, so that nothing contradicted the identity they were trying to install in the citizenry. And it worked, not because Russians were gullible, but because when you saturate someone's information environment with a single narrative long enough, that narrative becomes their reality. Their sense of what's normal, what's possible, what's true, all of it changes based on that. And cults have done the same thing on a smaller scale. The very first move before the weird rituals and the isolation compounds is really always controlling the information flow. Cut off the old inputs, replace them with new ones, limit contact with anyone who might contradict the new narrative, and within weeks, sometimes days, the person starts thinking differently, seeing differently, and believing differently. The identity shifts, not through argument or persuasion, but through the sheer weight of consistent, uninterrupted information pointing in one direction. No contradiction. Now, obviously, those are dark examples, but the mechanism itself is really completely neutral. The mechanism is just this: whatever you consistently feed your mind becomes your worldview. That's it. That's the whole thing. So the question isn't whether your inputs are shaping your identity, because they absolutely are every single day. That's not even a question. The question is whether you're going to let that process happen to you by accident through whatever algorithm-driven content and ambient noise happens to reach you, or whether you're going to do it to yourself on purpose. Basically, you become your own glavlet, except instead of suppressing truth, you're suppressing the old narrative. You're filtering out the inputs that anchor the past self and flooding in the inputs that accelerate the future self. And when you do that consistently, the same mechanism that reshapes populations and cult members basically reshapes you, except this time you're the one holding the controls. So be ruthlessly selective about your inputs during the acceleration phase. Every piece of content you consume is either moving you towards the future self or anchoring you to the current or past self. And there's no neutral content during an active identity shift. So the saturation effect of aligned inputs is more powerful than most people realize, where when everything you read, listen to, and watch reflects the identity you're actually building, your brain starts to accept that identity as normal and natural much faster than it would through a single daily journaling session alone, for example. Now, the second element is compression, meaning you deliberately compress the timeline of identity change by increasing the intensity and frequency of identity reinforcing experiences so that months of gradual shifts happen in weeks. So you increase the frequency of identity evidence collection from twice a day to throughout the day, where you have multiple touch points, where brief moments of awareness where you catch yourself acting from the future self's identity, and mentally or even physically by writing it down, you log the evidence. And that increased frequency is really what produces a much faster accumulation of proof than the standard morning and evening approach that I've covered before. Now, these micro-evidence moments can be as brief as 10 seconds, where you simply notice that you just made a choice the future self would make, and then you acknowledge it internally, or you write it down somewhere. And those 10-second acknowledgements add up to a powerful cumulative effect over the course of a day. And the micro-evidence practice becomes habitual quickly, where after a week or two of deliberate practice, your brain starts automatically flagging future self-aligned moments, and that automatic flagging is itself a sign that the identity shift is accelerating. Another thing you could do here is to increase the intensity of the formal identity sessions by adding emotional depth, where instead of just intellectually noting the evidence, you actually feel the truth of the new identity in your body. And that emotional intensity makes each piece of evidence count for more in terms of its impact and your self-concept. So spending 2 to 3 minutes in the morning actually visualizing yourself moving through the day as the future self with enough detail that you can actually feel the confidence or the clarity and the ease that the future self carries will create a very powerful priming effect that colors your entire day. And practicing physical embodiment of the future self, meaning deliberately adopting their posture, their pace, their breathing pattern, and their facial expression, creates a somatic anchor that reinforces the identity shift from the body up. Now, the final and third element here is elimination, meaning you identify and deliberately eliminate the behaviors, relationships, environments, and thought patterns that anchor you to your current or past self. Because acceleration isn't just about adding new identity inputs, it's equally about removing the old ones. So audit your daily behaviors and identify which ones belong to the old self and which ones belong to the future self. And then start eliminating the old self behaviors one at a time by replacing each one with the corresponding future self behavior. And that deliberate replacement is much more effective than trying to add new behaviors without removing the old ones. So each behavioral replacement creates a tangible daily difference that basically reinforces the identity shift, where every time you do the future self thing instead of the old self thing, you're creating evidence and building the neural pathways simultaneously. And the replacements create momentum where each successful swap makes the next one easier, and the cumulative effect of multiple behavior replacements over a few weeks produces a daily experience that feels dramatically different from where you started. And honestly, assessing which relationships support the future self and which anchor the old self is one of the hardest, but probably one of the most impactful parts of the acceleration protocol. And you don't necessarily have to end relationships. You just need to be aware of which ones are accelerating your growth and which ones are slowing it down. So setting some boundaries with relationships that anchor the old self, like spending less time in those contexts or maybe changing the dynamic of those interactions, will protect the transformation without requiring you to burn bridges. And then actively seeking out relationships with people who already embody qualities of your future self will expose you to new standards and new possibilities. And it's that exposure that accelerates the shift by making the future self's way of operating feel normal and achievable. Now, with that said, once you've done that, you need to know how to live as the future self now. So let's cover that. So at some point in the acceleration process, you will stop working towards the future self and start living as the future self. And that transition is the most important moment in the entire transformation. And the key insight is really that the transition doesn't happen after you've completed some checklist of changes. It happens when you decide to act as if the transformation is already complete right now, today, even while the evidence is still accumulating. It's a complete assumption, basically. The decision to live as the future self now is exactly that. It's a decision. And it can be made at any point in the process, and making it earlier rather than later actually accelerates the transformation further, because living as the future self produces more evidence of being the future self than any amount of working towards the future self ever could, right? It's logical. Most people are waiting for permission to basically become who they want to be. They wait until they feel ready, they wait until they've earned it, they wait until the circumstances are right. And that waiting is really the single biggest break on the transformation, because readiness isn't something that arrives, it's something you claim. Now, you can decide right now, today, that you are the person you've been working to become. It's really a decision. Tony Robbins used to say that change is instant, and it's only the decision that takes time. And you can start making every decision from that identity, starting with the next decision you face. And that immediate shift in operating position produces a lot more change in a single week than months of gradual progression. And it takes courage to make that decision before the external evidence fully supports it, where you're essentially claiming an identity that you haven't fully earned by conventional standards. And that courage is itself evidence of the new identity, because the future self would absolutely make that kind of bold decision. They wouldn't be looking for permission, right? And once the decision is made, embodiment is the practice of maintaining it moment by moment, where every interaction, every decision, every reaction is filtered through the question of how the future self would handle this. That constant filtering gradually replaces the old automatic responses with new ones until the filtering becomes unnecessary because the new responses are automatic. Now, the embodiment gets easier with practice, where the first few days of living as the future self feel like an intense performance, but after a week or two, it starts to feel natural. And after a month or two, it just feels like who you are. And that transition from performance to identity is the transformation itself. And the integration deepens over time, where the future self's way of thinking, feeling, and responding becomes increasingly embedded in your neural architecture. And the old self's patterns gradually fade from disuse. And after enough time, the old self starts to feel like a distant memory. And you'll notice gaps, meaning moments where maybe you slip back into old patterns. Maybe you respond from the old identity rather than a new one. Those gaps are normal. You should expect those. And they're actually valuable data about which areas of the transformation still need attention. Each gap is really a learning opportunity, where the fact that you notice the slip means your awareness is working. And noticing the specific trigger that caused the slip tells you exactly where to focus your next round of identity work. And that targeted focus will produce faster results than any general self-improvement can. So the recovery time from each gap gets shorter as the new identity solidifies, where at first you might spend hours in the old pattern before noticing, then it becomes minutes, then it becomes seconds, and eventually you cache the old pattern at the trigger and redirect it in real time. And that decreasing recovery time is really one of the clearest metrics of transformation progress. So approaching the gaps with curiosity, leaning into them rather than frustration, will keep the process productive, where beating yourself up for slipping back creates negative emotional associations with the transformation work itself, and those negative associations will slow the process down rather than speeding it up. So you need to be very careful about what kind of emotional associations and what kind of thought patterns you create through this whole thing. Now, the gaps also provide powerful evidence when you handle them well, where catching an old pattern and choosing the new response is actually stronger identity evidence than a day where the old pattern never fires at all, because the continuous choice in the face of trigger demonstrates the identity in a way that smooth sailing doesn't, right? Each successfully navigated gap strengthens the new identity more than the easy day does. It's the gaps where the real growth work happens, which means you should welcome them. So you need to flip that thinking from the gaps are something negative to the gaps are opportunities to basically collect evidence that the new identity is becoming real. And tracking the frequency and the duration of those gaps over time will give you a clear picture of the transformation progress, because fewer and shorter gaps mean that the new identity is consolidating, and that trend data is some of the most motivating information your journal will ever produce. Eventually, after enough daily practice and enough accumulated evidence, the future self becomes the permanent self, meaning the identity shift completes and the new way of operating becomes your genuine default. And afterwards, if you want to keep growing, this whole process basically repeats. So the consolidation happens gradually, and then it happens suddenly, where for months it might feel like you're actively maintaining the new identity. And then one day you realize you haven't had to think about it in weeks because it's just who you are now. And it's that realization that is the moment that the transformation becomes permanent. And the permanence will most likely feel natural, where the new identity doesn't feel like something you built or constructed. It feels like something you discovered, like you were always this person underneath the old patterns, and the transformation just revealed that to you. The transformation was really just a process of removing what was covering it up. And the permanent identity is stable in a way that maintained identity isn't, where disruptions and challenges, they might temporarily shake your behavior, but they can't touch the core identity. And the behaviors rebuild automatically after any disruption, because that's just how the identity works now. So you don't have to even work on getting back on track anymore. It just happens automatically once you've adopted this new identity fully, once it has become permanent. And once the current future self becomes the permanent self, the whole process starts again with a new future self. Like I said, meaning you define the next level, you identify the new gap, and you begin the acceleration protocol towards a version of yourself that your current self can barely imagine. And that cycle of continuous expansion is what produces a life of ongoing growth and transformation. The process has no endpoint. There's always a next level. And the skills you've built through this transformation, the journaling, the evidence, the collection, the identity work, the environmental design, all of it transfers directly into the next cycle, making each subsequent transformation faster and easier than the rest. And so the compound effect of multiple transformation cycles over years will produce a person who is unrecognizable from who they were at the start. And that radical transformation is available to anyone who commits to the process and trusts the compounding. So with that said, let's review what we covered. We went through the overview, the gap between selves, the acceleration protocol, living as the future self now, the review, and finally, your action items for the day or the next few days. First, spend 20 minutes today writing a detailed description of your future self, including their daily behaviors, their default emotional state, how they handle challenges, what they prioritize, how they spend their time, and any other details that you can imagine. You basically have to imagine that you're writing a character for a book you're writing or for a movie you're writing. So you have to describe them in that much detail with enough specificity that you could live a full day as that person. And then you need to make the decision right now to start living as that future self today, and filter your next 5 decisions through the question of what the future self would choose, and journal about how it felt to operate from that identity. If you've ever played pretend as a kid, it's very similar. And then finally, identify 3 specific behaviors, habits, or environmental cues that anchor you to your old self and replace each one with a corresponding future self version this week. With that said, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope it brought a lot of value. Again, if you want to work with me one-on-one, make sure to book a call from the link in the description. Once again, if you want this training along with this document, join the free community from the link in the description. And if you want weekly newsletters that will help you improve in every aspect of your life, meaning health, wealth, love, and self, then make sure to join the newsletter, again, from the link in the description. Once again, thank you for being here. Thank you for the support, and I'll see you in the next one.